Thanks for that introduction. Hopefully you've followed the work of FIRE. I am extraordinarily proud of the organization as, I'm sorry to explain, I am a political liberal. My vice president is a Republican conservative Christian. My legal director is a former Green Party member, and the legal director who still works with us before that is a libertarian. We have Muslims and Jewish people, Jewish faith, Christians, non-religious people, all working in the same office. And it's something that's increasingly rare in the society. But we never agree on the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, due process, and freedom of conscience. And it's something that I think society could use more of. Sure. Sorry. You can still hear me? Okay. So why did I write the book? Well, first I want to start by focusing just briefly on the law. Okay, got it. This is a quote from a 1957 Supreme Court case called Sweezy V New Hampshire. I don't know if you can read the whole quote from there, but check out the ending. Teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die. Very strong language, unusually strong language. But they're trying to make the point that there's nothing less than the fate of our democracy at stake on our college campuses. The Supreme Court has been very clear about the protection of freedom of speech on college campuses. And since 1989, every challenge to politically correct speech codes, many of which FIRE itself has been involved in, has resulted in the defeat of that speech code. Nonetheless, this is the kind of stuff I deal with on a daily basis. So hopefully you can see that. A student was reading this book at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. It's a book about the defeat of the Klan. When they marched on Notre Dame in 1924, the Klan was defeated by Catholic students defending Notre Dame. It celebrates the defeat of the Klan. But because the book had this cover, literally judging a book by its cover, the student was found guilty of a racial harassment without so much as a hearing. This book was in the campus library, by the way. It wasn't as if the university was unfamiliar with it, but despite the fact that he explained that it wasn't a racist book, that he wasn't a racist, all of this stuff, it didn't matter. It offended a student, an employee at that university, and that's all. And that was enough. So this guy, and being branded a racial harasser is quite an incredible thing. People would assume that you were a member of the Klan as opposed to reading a book about their defeat. And this took a campaign that included FIRE and the Wall Street Journal and about 6 months of work in order to win this. Again, the law is clear. This is constitutionally protected speech. It's not a close call, but explaining that to people on college campuses, you wouldn't, they don't seem to know that. There's also a video that I sometimes open up showing, but I figured I'd prefer to talk this time around. And it's about the case, what's currently going on at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. Also a similar case going on in Tufts. If you had told me before I worked for FIRE that I would constantly be dealing with cases involving attempts to kick evangelical students off campus or to otherwise interfere with the rights of evangelicals, I would have said that sounds like a little bit of an exaggeration. I've been doing this now for 11 years, and I have to tell you it happens all the time, and it's horrifying. Now, what's funny, and I talk about this in the book, is that we've had cases where when Muslim students, for example, have added in their statement of faith that they believe, for example, in traditional marriage, there have been attempts to de-recognize them in a couple cases, like Louisiana State University. And of course, FIRE gets involved. We say, they have the right to their beliefs. And what's funny about those few cases is that when we engage the general counsels there, they go, wait a second, we probably shouldn't be telling religious groups what they can believe. And it's like, yes. And now you need to understand that for the evangelicals on campus. But this has been going on for years, and it's very see-through. We had a case at University of Wisconsin where a student was told he couldn't have a Bible study meeting in his own room at his own time. And when asked, when he pressed about why can't I have a Bible study meeting in my own room, my own time at a public university, And he was told that if students knew that you were an evangelical Christian, they might not feel comfortable talking to you. Yeah, and I, you know, I'm not a religious person, and I showed up just absolutely outraged about that. I'm like, think about this. Think about if you had like a gay student or a Jewish student or a Muslim student, and an administrator came to them and said, well, you know, we have some tremendous anti-Semites on your floor, so it's cool that you're Jewish, but just be Jewish off campus. It would immediately occur to them. Nonetheless, we've had to fight these cases on campus after campus, and right now, I think we're at about 15 Christian groups are no longer on Vanderbilt campus because they refuse to agree to the idea that they will not, quote unquote, discriminate against, wait for it, non-Christians. We've seen this ridiculous argument come up time and time again, where universities are trying to tell Christian groups that it's discrimination to exclude atheists, people who don't believe, who aren't evangelicals from their groups. It's a ridiculous argument, but nonetheless, universities have looked to the Supreme Court for guidance in this. And the one thing that the Supreme Court said on it, which was a ridiculous opinion from the get-go, but said that if a university wanted to ban groups from discriminating on the basis of belief, they have to do it entirely across the board. That means a conservative group can't exclude non-conservatives. An environmentalist group has to exclude people who are hostile to them. The Muslim group has to allow atheists to be members and even leaders of that group. And the only thing that kept this opinion from not being a complete disaster was this requirement that it be entirely across the board. And of course, the wonderful Ninth Circuit took that requirement out of its interpretation of the opinion, leaving universities to just apply this against religious groups if it wants to. So, and then there's just a good old-fashioned problem of over-regulation. This is, by the way, not a lot of people know this, but in 2005, the number of people involved full-time in administration passed the number of full-time instructors at universities, and has just continued going. The administrative bloat at universities is a large contributor to the problem because they write ridiculous policies, they try to enforce ridiculous policies, and of course they enforce them according to what opinions they like or dislike. I have this case up here in part because it's a recent win, but this is Sinclair Community College in Ohio. They were telling a pro-life group that it couldn't use protest signs anywhere on campus. So they took the sticks off the campus, and off the signs, and like, okay, well, it can't possibly mean that we can't have any kind of sign as a protest sign on campus. Yeah, that's what they meant. The cops came over and said, and the administration said, no signage whatsoever, so even just poster board that said their pro-life position, they had to put on the ground. Oh, again, you don't have to be a First Amendment lawyer to know this is laughably unconstitutional. This is not a close call. Nonetheless, Fire had been writing this university for years saying, guys, this is unconstitutional. You're going to lose if you get sued on this. And this is what the president had the temerity to say in defense of his ban on signs. He invoked 9/11 and Virginia Tech. And I like to show this because how shameful it is to invoke things that serious for something so, I mean, protest signs had nothing to do with either 9/11 or Virginia Tech, unless the things were really different than any of us think. And to actually invoke this lightly in order to do whatever you want is something that should rightfully be shamed. But meanwhile, and I've considered this case as part of sort of a couplet in Ohio, because just about 120 miles away at the University of Cincinnati, there was a libertarian student group that was trying to circulate a right-to-work petition. And they were told that in order to do that, they had to, one, apply to use the free speech zone 10 days in advance, and the speech zone itself was only 0.1% of the entire campus. And of course the libertarian students pointed out, but you're not enforcing this against everybody else. Whatever. And amazingly, what I find so amazing about so many fire cases that I talk about is that it's not just that that universities try to get away with this, but they seem to think that they're actually in the right. So they went into court to defend this 0.1% 10 days advance notice case, and obviously that was selectively enforced against libertarians, and of course they lost. A judge looks at this stuff and they can't help but laugh. And meanwhile, just to show that we protect people all across the political spectrum, and we're very proud of that. We're true believers in free speech due process. This is a case that I open up my book on Learning Liberty talking about, where a university president kicked a student out for putting a collage protesting a parking garage on Facebook. I can't do this story justice, but check out the book because it's utterly surreal. What came out in Discovery was that this parking garage had been the president's passion project for years. Students had protested it and previously stopped him from having this parking garage, which he referred to as being part of his legacy. And when a student tried again to protest it, and he was protesting in old-fashioned ways. He was writing to the Board of Regents. He wrote a letter to the editor. I mean, old-fashioned type protest. This university president starts having meetings among his staff trying to figure out how he can get the student kicked out. And it's almost comical if it wasn't so weird. And the administrators keep coming back saying, you can't kick a student out for protesting your parking garage. So what he does instead is he draws the student in to a meeting. He dresses him down for an hour and a half about how dare you criticize my parking garage. And afterwards, the student puts this collage, this is actually a recreation of the collage, which was just kind of beat up, on Facebook. His ferocious protest is to put this collage on Facebook. And it's called the Save Zachariah Memorial Parking Garage, making fun of the parking garage. Save, an environmentalist group on campus that the student thought had fallen down on the job. Zachariah, the name of the president. Memorial, a joke on the fact that he had said this was part of his legacy. So, what do you think the rationale for kicking Hayden Barnes out was? The university claimed, and actually the president claimed, that since this had the word memorial in it, and since memorials usually happen after you're dead, this is a death threat against the university president. Yeah. And it's funny, and I'm glad you guys are laughing, because when I tell this story on campus these days, people, the deference of so many students is stunning. They go, oh, well, of course they had a good reason. I'm like, what leads you to believe, of course they have a good reason, first of all? So I add a couple additional facts to it. The way that Hayden Barnes was notified about the fact he was being kicked out for being a quote-unquote, and this is adorable First Amendment language, clear and present danger on campus, was that they stapled this collage to his expulsion notice and slipped it under his door, telling me he had 48 hours to get off campus. If you think someone's going on a shooting spree, you don't slip a note under his door telling me he has to be off campus. And what was almost even funnier is the guy went immediately, fulfilled every possible thing he could do. He talked to 2 different psychologists within the 48-hour window that he had when he was supposed to be kicked out. He got 2 different psychologists independently to say, this guy is a threat to absolutely nobody. He's a threat to himself nor anybody else. And by the way, he's a believer in non-aggression and a decorated EMT. They couldn't have picked a worse person to focus on. And thankfully, after years of litigating this, we've reached the point where the president is being held personally liable in this case. And so I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal as an opportunity. If university presidents can realize that they have skin in the game, that they can be held personally liable for pulling these kind of shenanigans, then we stand a fighting chance. But this is what we're up against, and this is what we have to defeat, and we have plans to defeat them. I could talk to you all about them independently, possibly after the meeting. Also, I'm greg@thefire.org if you want to talk about them. But we have a full-time constitutional lawyer who evaluates. It's actually the daughter of Alan Charles Kors. She's a brilliant, Penn-educated lawyer, and she evaluates university policies and has almost since day one for FIRE. We evaluate 400 top colleges in the country, and we find that 62.1% of them maintain red light speech codes. What's a red light speech code? Simply put, laughably unconstitutional. When these things are challenged, they are defeated. It's not a close call. We have 17 universities that we give red lights to. Only 17 universities, and 62.1%. Now, and believe it or not, this is an improvement. When we first started doing this survey, it was 75% of universities had red light speech codes. But nonetheless, 62.1% maintained them. So what do I mean by speech codes? Well, the speech zones that I talked about previously count as speech codes. But check some of, we've been doing a daily show. We've been doing the speech code of the month since 2005, every month. And we're in no danger whatsoever of running out of material. So, and a great example of what's so wrong with these codes is that University of Connecticut, during the supposed heyday of political correctness, had a policy that banned inconsiderate jokes and inappropriately directed laughter. This got laughed out of the court of public opinion and laughed out of court at University of Connecticut in 1991. Amazingly, Drexel University in Philadelphia decided, oh, this looks like a great idea. So they essentially cut and pasted this ridiculous policy right into their policies, even though it had been defeated in a court of law. And you see this over and over again as they recycle this language that has been ruled unconstitutional and is also, by the way, ridiculous over and over again. And I think this has harms on many different levels, not the least of which educating an entire generation to believe that they have fewer rights than they do, and that the First Amendment is less robust than it is. And I think that this is really permeating the society. When you talk to students about, if you ask them if they believe in free speech, they tend to say, sure, I believe in free speech. But of course, you can ban things that offend me, things that I consider hurtful, things that are offensive, because it's all in the policies. So just to give a couple more examples of speech code of the month, Florida Gulf Coast University, and I love, my mother's British, so this has like particular appeal to me. It bans simply expressions deemed inappropriate. Vagueness and overbreadth is the standard for finding a code unconstitutional in the First Amendment, and that's a little vague and broad, to say the least. But I thought you might also enjoy California State University at Chico, which banned as sexual harassment, stereotypic generalizations of any kind, and continual use of generic masculine terms to refer to people of both sexes. So let that think in. The standard model for basically every newspaper in the country, by definition, is an offense at Chico State University. Yet these codes remain in force at the majority of campuses across the country. And then, of course, there's the problem with the complete obliviousness that universities have to the right of private conscience. These are some of the more serious cases, and unfortunately the ones that I feel like are least understood on campuses and sometimes get the most pushback. But they involve cases where students are told that they have to say things against their will, they have to sign ideological statements, that they have to go through orientation programs that require them to reveal personal facts about themselves. This is the power and control wheel from Michigan State University's Student Accountability in Community seminar. This is a seminar that was originally designed just for men, but then they were very open-minded and decided to open it to women, too, where if you got in trouble for showing, well, actually, you could get in trouble just for showing any aggressive behavior whatsoever. So they proudly gave the example of a girl got into a fight with her boyfriend and slammed a door, and she will be kicked out of Michigan State University unless she sits down for a pseudo-psychological session with a non-psychologist to go through this Student Accountability and Community seminar. So they gave the example of a student who had been rude to a receptionist. And you shouldn't be rude to a receptionist, and you can punish people for being rude to receptionists. But what they subjected him to for this was quite striking. So it's a 4-day program. You have to pay $50 for the privilege of going through this non-accredited pseudo-psychological program. And he's asked what he did wrong. And he says, I shouldn't have been rude to the receptionist. I'm sorry. No, that is not the answer. That is not the right way to say it, but they won't tell him what the right answer is. So they give him the power and control wheel. Was he using emotional abuse? Was he using intimidation? Was he using his economic or race privilege? Was he using sexual abuse? And he had to circle these things and then write again. What did I do wrong? And it's still not the right answer. So you go through 4 sessions of this. Eventually you're given the wheel of empowerment, and you have to circle what you could have done better next time. But what he had to say, and it had to come out of his own mouth, was he had to say, I felt entitled to be in the dormitories, and that was wrong. Given the ridiculous rates that these students are paying to be in the dormitories, he was entitled to be in the dormitories. He just shouldn't have been rude to a receptionist. But there was no idea that there's anything wrong with making someone say something against their will. And that is fundamentally, that is not compatible with a free society. Probably the most famous case that we have involving the right of private conscience is the case at University of Delaware that we had a couple of years ago. This is a case that, and again, I spend nearly an entire chapter in the book talking about this, where all 7,000 students in the dormitory were subjected to what they literally called a treatment within campus to help them get over their assumed to be racist and sexist attitudes about everything. Now, it's funny because they did a survey of the students when they were coming in, and they came out as actually really shockingly tolerant, like millennials are. But nonetheless, they had this entire program predicated on the idea that essentially these students are sick, and it's up to residents' life to heal them. And it was a day-to-day program that included a speech code that put offensive comments at the same level as assault or vandalism, and mandatory floor programs that included, there was one, the mandatory floor program where you'd bring up something like eating disorders. Is it socially constructed or culturally? You have to choose a right answer. Go to this wall if you have the right one, go to this one if you have the wrong one. Affirmative action, same thing. Go to this wall if you have this opinion, this wall if you have the wrong one. Public assistance. And when students tried to say, I actually haven't totally made my mind up about this. And tragically, one of the eating disorder one involved a girl who said, I have an eating disorder and I don't know if it's fully culturally constructed or if it's something that's more about me. And they said, no. In the real world, you have to choose a side. You can't stay on the fence, get against one of the walls. And what's striking to me about this is how anti-scholarly this is. The idea that you can't reserve judgment, that you can't be judicious, that you have to make up your mind and then be publicly shamed for it. It's completely anti-scholarly, but the creepiest thing of all in the program, to me at least, was the mandatory questionnaires that students had to fill out about what races and sexes they would date. So, and this is real, this is all documented. You can see this at the Fire website. They proudly document this whole situation. A RA, who I believe is a junior residence assistant, the people run the dorms, has a mandatory meeting, and so it's not really his fault, with a freshman girl. She is given this questionnaire about what races and sexes she would date, with the goal of getting her more open to dating people of different races and sexes. And when she is asked, when did you discover your sexual identity? She writes, none of your damn business. Appropriate answer, state official asking you about your sex life. They wrote her up because they designated her as one of the worst students on the floor. They put her name up in things that were published all throughout the university. They put her room number at least up in their documentation because pushing back against this invasive program was considered to be a violation of potentially policy. When I spoke at University of Delaware after we'd gotten them to repeal this policy, they were proud of the fact. They were like, well, we didn't actually end up going through with the whole judicial process, finding her guilty of harassment. So they were actually proud of that. So, and how do I think this is, and I believe that this is demonstrably affecting students. The American Association of Colleges and Universities came out with this study just while I was working on the book. They asked 24,000 students this milquetoast question. Is it safe to merely hold unpopular positions on your campus? That is a question that is designed to be a whitewash. That is a question that is designed because basically what they're leaving out is like, if you really want to know if it's safe to have controversial points of view, you'd ask, is it safe to express them? Are people who disagree with you, are they welcome to hear it? Is this a place where it's safe to talk about anything, to actually talk and engage about it? But they're saying, is it safe to merely hold unpopular positions on campus? And look what the results are. I think they were aiming for 100% of students to say, well, duh, it's safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus, as long as I don't talk about them. As long as I don't talk to professors who disagree with me, as long as I don't engage someone who might have a strong opinion as well. But nonetheless, only 40% of freshmen strongly agreed with the statement that it's safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. And then every single year it goes down. By the time you're a senior, it's only 30% strongly agree with the statement that it's safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. And most tellingly of all, campus professionals, they asked 9,000 of them, something like 18.7%, only 18.7%, and only 16.7% of university professors strongly agreed with the statement. Meanwhile, some of the other things that I looked at for my book, one, there's a so-called silent classroom phenomena, where sociologists have been scratching their head to try to figure out, why are students so quiet in class these days? And it never comes up in all of this. And I'm up to my I remember reading the first article about this. I'm up to my neck in cases, a backlog of cases back in 2001, where students have actually been punished for their opinions. And you see all these sociologists scratching their head about, why are students hesitant to talk in class these days? I'm like, and you don't even consider once that they do actually get in trouble sometimes for expressing their point of view? That doesn't even factor in. And then, of course, and then probably the funniest study that I came across, but that was most sort of confirming to my larger thesis of how this fosters group polarization and more extreme beliefs and people having caricaturous ideas of what people believe that they disagree with, is that there is an inverse relationship between how many political disagreements you have in a week and how much education you have. What that means is that if you have high school or below education, you tend to have a lot of political disagreements, and you talk to people who you politically disagree with, and it's a straight line down as you get through college and PhDs, et cetera, that you talk to fewer and fewer people with which you politically disagree. And that leads to that. In other words, the more education you have, the thicker your echo chamber is. And that leads to all sorts of problems. And the nice thing is the problems of having a thick echo chamber: greater certainty, caricaturous ideas of what people you disagree with believe, and it also magnifies everything that's wrong with our society. Meanwhile, a truly intellectual, truly educated person should understand that it's a duty. It's an intellectual duty to seek out the smart person you disagree with. And if you have a situation where the more education you have, the less you're doing that, we've done something terribly, terribly wrong. But who's giving them these lessons? Now, I'm not saying it's just university professors. I think there's lots of things that contributes to this. But university professors, at best, are not making things better, and in a lot of cases are making things worse. Take this example of Sally Jacobson at Northern Kentucky University. This is a case where students put up a pro-life display involving little crosses, and it was to protest abortion. And Professor Jacobson was offended by this display. So she goes in front of her class and she says, "I'm offended by this display. I think we should exercise our First Amendment rights to destroy this display." And she goes out, takes her students, happily, just smiling, if you might not be able to see from there, destroys the display. Reminds me of sort of like a weird Godzilla movie. And throws them all out. And even afterwards, when asked about this, she believes that she had a First Amendment right not to be offended. So if even professors are teaching this stuff, and seem genuinely to believe this, we're in deep trouble. And this is getting reflected at university campuses when Students for Liberty, for example, or Young Americans for Liberty, two libertarian student groups that we work with quite a bit, try to put up free speech walls. They're just pieces of paper, and it's an experiment where you're given markers, and you can write whatever you want on the free speech wall. And the goal is to prove that if you allow for this, just like our society does, the sky will not fall. It will not be nearly as bad as you think. And some of these things have ended up being really clever. There was one where one of the first things written on the free speech wall was the salary of the university president, which I thought was great. So they crack jokes. They're a little bawdy. They're 18 to 24-year-olds in a lot of different cases. But nonetheless, the sky does not fall. But increasingly, these things are getting torn down by university students and university professors who are draping themselves in nobility. They basically think that they're the heroes. They think that they're striking out against an oppressive system. And what's interesting about this is that the most striking case that I've seen about this recently was one in Canada, where a student tore down a free speech wall, not because it said anything that he found offensive, but because it could. Because while a lot of people don't necessarily always like free speech in practice, at least there's general agreement among at least regular American citizens that we believe in free speech in theory. Increasingly on college campuses and increasingly among students, you're seeing that they don't even agree with it in theory. They think it's a problem and it has to be stopped. So this is my homework. I actually brought 3 free copies of the book. I'm happy to give them out as long as people promise to read them. That's my one condition on handing out books. We have a Fire Student Network. I just left a sign-up sheet if you want to sign up to hear from Fire in the future. And you also get a free T-shirt. Check out your school's policies at thefire.org and fight back. Well, we don't have to accept campus censorship as some kind of strange new normal. So, thank you.